So thank you all for being here. Thank you all for being here again. We are going to switch now to our first panel. And this panel is entitled Violence, Rememory, History of Ideas. And so I would like to invite Associate Professor Evelyn Simien of Political Science in the Institute for African American Studies at the University of Connecticut to join us at the table. Assistant Professor Shatima Threadcraft of Political Science of Rutgers University, and Associate Professor Kathryn Gines, the interim head of the Department of African American Studies and the Department of Philosophy at the Pennsylvania State University, to join us at the table. One of the things each of these scholars is going to be talking about is the kinds of genealogies that animate their work and make it possible. And as you all know, a major thrust of the conference is thinking about impact factor in a different kind of way. You all know that Google and EBSCO and all of these databases will send you updates from time to time about how many people are reading your articles, right? That data and the algorithms that they use does not effectively capture the real reach of scholarship on Black women in politics. So the research design that's part of this conference actually allows the scholars themselves to be the reflectors on what this research means and what kind of impact it has, who their audiences are, and which genealogies they're intending to intervene in. So these scholars will have probably a little bit more time than we thought initially in your program. It talks about Associate Professor Sarah Clark Kaplan of UCSD, and she's not able to join us today, so she will not be here. If those of you all have not read Sarah Clark Kaplan's work, please do find it. Please do find it. So please join me in welcoming the panel on violence, rememory, and history of ideas.
Well, good morning. I am Evelyn Simien. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Connecticut. I hold a joint appointment with the Institute for Africana Studies, and I'm affiliated with Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, also at the University of Connecticut. Oh, and I forget, I'm also affiliated with American Studies, that program as well. So thank you for being here. It's a pleasure. It's exciting. I am coming from the East Coast, and so I'm probably a little exhausted. So I've been told by many of you that you'd be watching me very closely to set the tone for how this would be done. And in fact, someone said to me, "So are you doing a PowerPoint?" And so I scrambled and did a PowerPoint. But I understand it hasn't come through. I've sent it as an email attachment. Oh, she thinks she got it. It's only 3 or 4 slides, and you have Angela Lewis to thank for that. Because it was not on my brain. It was not a thought that occurred to me that I would do a PowerPoint. And again, it's very simple. It's only got like 3 or 4 slides, which are just visual images, really. And so I guess I'll cue at some point when to fast forward the slide. But I will go ahead and get started as she preps that.
Y'all let me know if my halo is blocking the slide.
So I want to thank Tiffany again for organizing this, and I see so many familiar faces. It's a pleasure, and I look forward to meeting those of you that I don't already know. So I'll start by saying, pre-tenure, I had a really bold claim I was making, that I was going to, quote-unquote, chart a course, for Black women's studies and political science. I was fresh out of graduate school. I received my PhD from Purdue University in 2001. And at the time in which I entered political science, there were very, very few Black women. Many of the women were senior, like Jewel Prestige, like Shelby Lewis, and Catherine Tate. And so when I myself, Julia Jordan-Zachary, Anja Marie Hancock, Nicole Alexander Floyd, and others emerged onto the scene, in a lot of ways we were trailblazers in our own right, because we were boldly willing to focus on the intersection of race and gender and study African American women and gender politics within the discipline of political science, which we know is heavily white and male and pretty hostile toward the study of intersectionality. At least when we entered the discipline, it was not a sexy, hot topic that the discipline was willing to entertain, much less embrace and have panels on or create a section at a regional conference. So pre-tenure, my first book was called Black Feminist Politics, Black Feminist Voices in Politics, and it was based on large N survey data. So in my mind, I thought I would use the master's tools, quantitative analysis, to otherwise legitimize a marginalized topic in this cold discipline. And so it's also what would satisfy my dissertation committee, right? But I would say when I went on the job market, I was still told I wasn't going to find a job. But I had made a very deliberate choice, a very deliberate decision to study African American women and their voices, looking at how Black feminist consciousness would then impact political behavior. One finding that was controversial and often debated, in fact, by philosophers. So one of the questions, when we look at, our presentation tips for today, we're expected to talk about our impact and how do we think we've influenced respective disciplines. So I can say, I came up with my own data set that replicated many of the survey items that appeared in the 1993 National Black Politics Study. And in 2004, 2005, I fielded the National Black Feminist Study because I wanted to look at Black attitudes over time and our attitudes toward gender equality and feminist priorities. One controversial finding that philosophers often debate with regard to my work is this finding that African American men are equally, and in some cases more likely to support Black feminist consciousness than Black women. This is a result that has gotten a lot of attention, a lot of debates, like are Black men just giving us politically correct answers? So fast forward a decade later, this finding persists. Of course, as a quantitative person, you could say, well, let's look at the survey questions. What type of questions is she asking, right? And so one particular question has to do with whether or not you support the Black church having more Black women clergy. This is a question where overwhelmingly Black men in the survey, and this is over 1,000 respondents of the age of 18 and older, respond affirmatively, yes. And we know that's a really controversial issue in Black churches. And it's Black women, coincidentally, who make up the churches, who attend church on a weekly basis, who define the congregations that actually oppose the idea of more Black women at the pulpit. So much of the work pre-tenure focused on Black feminist attitudes within the Black community, using quantitative methods and survey research to study our attitudes, and then considering how our attitudes then elicit political behavior. Post-tenure, now I'm tenured and I'm promoted, and the discipline decides intersectionality is sexy, it's interesting, it's hot. When sociology's been doing it for, years, we're late in the conversation. And while in my own mind I thought what I did was study African American women in politics, the discipline labels me an intersectionality scholar. And at the American Political Science Association, I'm among a lineup of people like Julia, like Nicole, and Anja Marie that are asked to define what is intersectionality research. And it's a very well-attended panel, and the outcome of that was a special issue of Politics and Gender devoted to intersectionality research in political science. So fast forward, this body of work has influenced political science. I'd say sociology has used my data set. The psychologists have used my data set, the National Black Feminist Study. And philosophers have debated the merits of my results. Now, fast forward, post-tenure, I decide I don't want to do these numbers anymore. And I become an associate director, then a director of a humanities institute. And I do a NEH, Summer Institute at Harvard on the Civil Rights Movement. And the result of that is a book called Gender and Lynching, The Politics of Memory. So the first week, so this is why I'm on this panel called Violence, Rememory, History of Ideas. Because the first week at Harvard for the Summer Institute, Leon Litwack comes, and he talks about lynching. And I learned that men, black men, weren't the only targets, that there were women, there were children, there were families that were lynched together. But prior to being lynched, black women were often gang raped, alongside their husbands, alongside their children, their sons in particular. I became interested in the circumstances surrounding our deaths, our torture, our lynching. And so the second book focuses on African American women like Laura Nelson, like Mary Turner, and their stories. I became interested in a legacy of exclusion where we are not heard and our stories are not told. And so today it resonates as we attempt to say her name, right? Albeit as late as it is 2016. And so what I say now is that I attempt to expose a bias in civil rights history. My edited book is an interdisciplinary project. It came out in 2011. And I argue that though women represent the minority of lynching victims, their stories challenge previous dominant interpretations of lynching as justified protection for white women from black male rapists. I argue that if we are to fully understand lynching and the motivation behind it, scholars must begin to include analyses of African American women who were similarly robbed of their dignity, their respect, and bodily integrity by a weapon of terror to maintain a racial caste system. And by including women centrally within this historical narrative of lynching, we not only avoid reinforcing that rape-lynch myth, but in so doing also reveal a much more complete understanding of this devastating social practice. And so by forcing readers to grapple with the legacy of exclusion and to consider the impact of that exclusion, Gender and Lynching sheds light on what I call a fundamentally flawed approach that wrongfully characterizes African American men as the sole victims of lynching. Said approach, to my mind, of the study of lynching in the United States is unprecedented as it brings African American women to the fore as victims and martyrs, characters in the works of art and literature, as well as activists and change agents in a particularly innovative way. Fast forward, Daniel McGuire, who's the author of At the Dark End of the Street, and I co-author an article that appeared in Politics and Gender. And I think 2014 was the publication date. And we look at African American women who, during the heyday of the civil rights movement, 5 minutes, good. So fast forward, we look at the 1950s and 60s, and African American women like Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, Rosa Parks, and we sort of reimagine Rosa Parks as, I often like to say, an Olivia Benson who's investigating sex crimes in the state of Alabama. She's not a secretary in the traditional sense of the word. She's not taking minutes at the meeting. She's not answering the phone, but she is actually interviewing victims of rape and sexual assault in the state of Alabama. And so it's this particular piece that is an extension of my prior work that focused on gender and lynching, but it's a different time period. But it's the same sort of pattern of sexual assault against black women. Fast forward, there's been another book that has come out, and it's more in the same vein of the public opinion and quantitative methods used to study what I call intersectionally marginalized actors. And by way of extension, I take the concept of intersectionality and apply it to the candidacies of Shirley Chisholm, Jesse Jackson, Barack Obama, and Hillary Clinton to talk about how these presidential hopefuls were both advantaged on account of one axis of identity and then disadvantaged in another sense. So in the case of Hillary Clinton, she capitalizes on her whiteness, while at the same time she's arguably disadvantaged because of her being a woman running for a very masculine position, the office of president. And so I kind of see myself as a researcher that I go back and forth and alternate in terms of methodology, in terms of research focus. Fast forward since that book came out in November of 2015, my future research and what I'm currently working on is dealing with sex trafficking. So I go back to violence and women and a more qualitative approach that includes focus groups, elite interviewing, survey research again, but the interest is merging the research that talks about women as victims who have been victims of sex trafficking, but victim-related homicide. And so I'm interested in merging the research that talks about Black women who are at high risk, the highest risk of homicide in this country, and at the same time at risk of being victims of sex trafficking, in merging the two, because there are many women who apparently once they are part of sex trafficking, their life expectancy is only 7 years beyond that. And it's the result of homicide because they are often targeted by serial killers. And so I'm at the very early stages of doing that groundwork. But it is probably the most engaged scholarship that I've done thus far, as I'm sitting down with state legislators, law enforcement, and the very person that has written all of the legislation that's been passed in Connecticut dealing with sex trafficking in our state. And so that's currently where I'm at, and that's what I'm working on right now. So I'll stop there.
So I have exactly 7 pages. I'm going to estimate they'll take 2 minutes per page, so I should come in under 15 minutes. Okay, so thank you so much, Tiffany, to the staff assistants, students, sponsors, and participants for making this conference possible. This is an amazing experience. Also, whenever I present, I like to always express gratitude to family, kinfolk, and friends who do what they do so that we can do what we do. So I can be here, yes, round of applause for them. So I can be here because I co-parent with a partner with whom I trust our 4 children when I am traveling. Okay, so my remarks will be presented in 5 short sections. The first section is Prelude, Embracing the Ambiguity of Intersectionality. Number 2, a little bit about my educational background. Number 3, my scholarship and my approach to philosophy. Number 4 is Interventions 1, or we can call this Impact 1, the Collegium of Black Women Philosophers. And then number 5 is Interventions or Impact 2, Work, Life, Wellness, Balance, and Bliss. So part number 1, Embracing the Ambiguity. I'm going to front load the notion of intersectionality here by saying simply and directly that I find intersectionality to be both empowering and exhausting. Empowering in spaces like this, in which we can really see, hear, engage, and affirm one another, and tiresome in other places that we might occupy, like imperialist, colonialist spaces, predominantly white institutions, and professional organizations, in which it can be physically, intellectually, and emotionally exhausting to exist at so many intersections. From identity intersections like race, gender, class, sexual orientation, age, language, and/or ability, to intersections of theoretical traditions, to intersections operating across departments and areas of specialization. It can be physically, intellectually, and emotionally exhausting to be expected to know all of the white man's canon when many of them can hardly name or cite any women scholars. And to be expected to know all of the white woman's canon when many of them can hardly name, cite any scholars of color, male or female. And to be expected to know all of the black man's canon when many of them can hardly name, cite any women scholars, including women scholars of color. And the Latino man's canon, when many of them, too, can hardly name or cite any women scholars, including women scholars of color. It can be physically, intellectually, and emotionally exhausting to be constantly quizzed on everyone else's canon by the very scholars who willfully neglect one's own, or worse, denies that it even exists. What did he just say? Did she really just say that? Did I hear what I think I heard? Did that just come out of my mouth, his mouth, your mouth? But today, I'm not going to focus on these frustrations, because we are here in this uplifting, affirming space in which we can be seen, heard, believed, celebrated. Yes, we are. Oh, yes, we'll clap on that. Thanks, Tiffany. Yes, we are remembered bonds from dismembered wholes, and we are here. Thank you. Gathered together to think about scandal in real time, Black women, politics, and oral history. Okay, point number 2, educational background. I studied philosophy at Spelman College, a historically Black liberal arts college for women where issues of race, gender, class, and sexuality were almost always central to our philosophical inquiries rather than marginal, invisible, or deemed unphilosophical. When I learned as an undergraduate student that there were only about 16 Black women at the time holding a PhD in philosophy, this was in the late 1990s, I felt a moral and personal obligation to increase our representation in the discipline. From Spelman, I went to the University of Memphis, where I earned an MA and PhD in philosophy. After defending my dissertation in 2003, I remained in Memphis for a 1-year postdoctoral fellowship, during which I taught courses in philosophy as well as African and African American studies. This would be followed by a research fellowship at Emory University and the Center for Humanistic Inquiry. I received my first tenure-track job in 2005 at Vanderbilt University with a primary appointment in African American and Diaspora Studies and a secondary appointment known there as a courtesy appointment. I guess they were doing me a courtesy in philosophy. In 2008, I accepted another fellowship and tenure-track job in philosophy at Penn State University, and I've been there since 2008. Number 3, scholarship, my approach to philosophy. At Penn State, I was hired in the area of critical philosophy of race with special interest in the African diaspora and/or African American philosophy. And I'm also trained and rooted in the continental philosophy tradition and Black feminist philosophy. I draw heavily from critical philosophy of race, feminist philosophy, and African American and Africana philosophy, all specializations that are pluralistic insofar as traditions like continental, analytic, American pragmatism, and various histories of philosophy, ancient to contemporary, influence them. Rather than segregating philosophical traditions or assuming that they are mutually exclusive, I integrate them, exploring how they inform one another, acknowledging the limitations of major philosophical figures, and taking seriously the import of voices that are marginalized or altogether excluded from the category philosophy. I've published on various topics, including race, racism, post-racialism, assimilation, feminism, violence, intersectionality, and sex and sexuality in contemporary hip-hop. I co-edited an anthology titled Convergences, Black Feminism and Continental Philosophy, which was published in 2010. My first single-authored book, Hannah Arendt and the Negro Question, published in 2014, recognizes Arendt's insights without ignoring her problematic oversights regarding the Negro question. I argue that a flaw in Arendt's orientation toward the Negro question lies in the fact that she, unlike Richard Wright, James Baldwin, and Ralph Ellison, sees the Negro question as a Negro problem rather than a white problem. Additionally, I love this. The call and response is awesome. Okay, I love you guys. Okay. Additionally, Arendt's rigid distinctions between the political, the social, and the private undergird her analysis of the Negro question and distort her understanding of and judgments about it. More specifically, Arendt's delineation of the Negro question as a social issue prevents her from recognizing that anti-Black racism is also a political phenomenon. In the book's preface, I explained that I did not see my experiences or myself as a Black woman adequately represented in Arendt's writings about the political in general or anti-Black racial oppression in particular. Toni Morrison has noted, if there's a book that you really want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. To this, Alice Walker adds, I write not only what I want to read, understanding fully and indelibly that if I don't do it, no one else is so vitally interested or capable of doing it to my satisfaction. I write the things that I should have been able to read. Until now, no book has focused primarily or exclusively on Hannah Arendt and the Negro question in the specific context of anti-Black racism and civil rights in the United States, the American, French, and Haitian revolutions and institutionalized slavery, French and British imperialism and colonialism, and racial violence. Following the advice of Morrison and Walker, this is the book about Hannah Arendt that I wanted to read and should have been able to read, so I wrote it. Okay, number 4, Interventions in Impact 1, Collegium of Black Women Philosophers. I founded the Collegium of Black Women Philosophers in 2007, at a very early stage in my career as an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University. Penn State has been the host institution for CBWP since 2008. CBWP is a philosophical organization whose purpose is to encourage and foster a networking and mentoring relationship between the underrepresented Black women in philosophy, including undergraduate and graduate students, assistant, associate, and full professors in the academy. The objective of CBWP is to mentor and retain Black women who are currently professors or graduate students in philosophy, while simultaneously recruiting more Black women into the discipline. The specific goals of the organization are as follows: to increase the representation of Black women in philosophy in the academy, to provide a network for participants to share their experience and expertise, to help participants in graduate programs in philosophy successfully complete the PhD and transition well into the job market in the academy, to help participants get into tenure-track positions, to help them successfully navigate the track to tenure and beyond, to help them develop research projects into publications, and to offer mentoring opportunities and professional development. In my estimation, CBWP also benefits the profession and discipline of philosophy through increased diversification along the lines of race, ethnicity, nationality, gender, and sexual orientation, to name a few. I received several emails from Black women students seeking to escape isolation and longing to connect to a welcoming philosophical community. One student writes, I am a sophomore and currently seeking degrees in philosophy and Africana studies. However, my philosophy department fights to shut me up. I was hoping that you could provide me with more information on the Collegium of Black Women Philosophers, as I hope to join. Another writes, I simply feel as though I have no community or encouragement here, and it's beginning to take a rather grave toll. Okay, I never get through this without crying. Okay. You are truly a huge inspiration for me. I felt this incredible surge of anxiety become lifted off my shoulders just from reading the contents of your website. And I share this because, thank you, we are typically on the grind on our own in a given department. I know that's true for philosophy, and, based on what I've heard here, it seems to be also the case for political science. Okay. A first-generation recent college graduate wrote, I love what you have started, a place where Black women can freely express their passion for philosophy in its various branches. If only I had known of CBWP while I was an undergrad, but thankfully I've now found a place where I will be encouraged to pursue my love of philosophy, all the while not denying the integral role that my ethnicity plays in how I view the world around me. And yet another student wrote, I would like to start by saying I'm so happy to have found the CBWP website. As an African-American woman, 22 years of age, with a passion for philosophy, I don't have anyone to turn to for guidance and advice. My areas include Spinoza, ethics, political philosophy, Africana philosophy, and social philosophy. All of these emails come from students doing online searches for Black women philosophers and finding my website. Okay, fifth and final section. I'm on the bottom of 6, so I'm 6 going on to 7. Okay, so intervention impact number 2, work-life wellness, balance, bliss. We all play multiple roles and function in various capacities in our lives. In my personal life, I'm a married mother of 4 children, ranging from preschool to high school. Professionally, I'm a philosopher as well as a professional coach specializing in work-life balance and yoga lifestyle practices. As Claudia Rankins writes, yes, the body has memory. The physical carriage hauls more than its weight. The body is the threshold across which each objectionable call passes into consciousness. All the unintimidated, unblinking, and unflappable resilience does not erase the moments lived through. Knowing this to be true, intellectually, emotionally, and experientially, yoga, meditation, running, laughing, and even crying are all activities that help with my mind-body wellness. As I live in balance with all of these areas of my life, each of which presents both challenges and fulfillment, the question I am most frequently asked is, how do you do it all? It is in responding to this question, drawing from my lived experience and philosophical background, that I founded Work-Life Wellness Balance Bliss. I offer workshops on meditation, work-life balance, wellness and self-care, and moving from balance to bliss for graduate students, academics, administrators, and non-academic professionals. As a master coach who is also a philosopher and registered yoga teacher with an elective specialization in yoga therapy, I am committed to being an active listener, co-inquirer, gentle agitator, and accountability partner in the self-realization and self-actualization journey. So I want to end by telling everyone here that you are invited to register for a complimentary 30-day meditation program that I'm offering June 1st through the 30th of 2016. This is something that you can register online for at www.balance.ktgphd, so my initials PhD. I also have sign-up sheets that I can send around, so if you want me to send you the registration link by email, I will do that. So this is my offering to all of us so that we can kind of get into a zone and take care of our bodies and our minds. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. This was an incredible panel to open with. Thank you very much, Dr. Simien, for setting the tone, as I knew you would. At this time, we have time for questions and comments and a little bit of feedback and discussion together. So I want to open the floor for questions and comments. I have my own, but I'm sure that there are others who also have questions and comments. Rolda?
Yes. Okay. I want to direct my question to the last scholar who spoke. First of all, Black female philosopher, those 3 words don't go together very often, as you pointed out. And so I'm really excited to hear you speak and talk about your work. So when you talk, I'm very much a novice when I talk. I'm a political scientist, but I'm very much a novice when I talk about theory and philosophy. So the first names that come to mind for me are Carol Pateman, Sexual Contract, and Charles Mills, Racial Contract. So my question to you is, in light of the work that you do in intersectionality and having those discussions about being a Black woman in philosophy, would you have coffee with Carol and tell her how to fix her scholarship? Or, sorry, I didn't mean that.
You meant it, it's okay.
I mean, they wrote a book together, but I don't believe it really addressed the gaps in their scholarship. Or would you have coffee with Mills and tell him how to fix his analysis or his scholarship?
So this is interesting. I mean, I think it's an interesting even phrasing of the question. So what it points out to me is the ways in which the intellectual and emotional labor of fixing falls on us for the gaps that exist in other, so this goes back to even my opening statements about how we're expected to know everyone else's canon and they're not expected to know our canon. So Carol Pateman is interesting. I know Charles Mills a lot better than I've met Carol Pateman, but I don't know her as well as I know Charles. I've seen them kind of do the lecture circuit together when the Contract and Domination book came out. What's interesting about seeing them on a lecture circuit is that Carol Pateman is very much disinvested from the social contract tradition. So she's very much wanting to continue to critique the social contract tradition from the standpoint of gender. I think she still misses the mark when it comes to theorizing this alongside race, or theorizing intersectionally the ways in which gender and race are having a different kind of impact than gender alone or race alone. And she falls into that kind of additive analysis trap that gets critiqued in intersectionality. Charles Mills is, I think, more invested, and I don't know if this is professionally strategic on this part, or if I think it's more professionally strategic, so I don't think he's personally invested in a social contract tradition, but he recognizes that the social contract tradition, liberalism more generally, So he wants to kind of save it in some ways, right? So he's invested on, like, how can I point out where the shortcomings are, and how can we build like a newer, better version of this, right? So I don't agree with him on that. But having said that, I'm actually currently working on a piece that is a Black feminist critique of his intersecting contracts, the chapter that he has in the Contract and Domination. So I'm not dealing with Carol Pateman. I mean, I find myself, I go to these philosophy conferences and I'm like calling out the white women on one panel, and then I'm calling out the Black men on another panel. And so I decided I'm not going to invest the time in writing a Carol Pateman thing. But I think Charles Mills is more open to kind of hear some of those critiques. So what's interesting about the intersecting contracts chapter is that he is very much steeped in important Black feminist literature there, right? So he's citing all the right people. But what's interesting and ironic, actually, given his whole analysis of epistemologies of ignorance, is that he cites all of this Black feminist literature and other women of color literature, yet still insists that race trumps gender. And so I'm like, well, Charles, how do you read all of these intersectional theorists and then still say, like, at least 4 times or 5 times in that chapter, but race trumps gender? And so that is kind of what I'm teasing out. So what's interesting is that he has done a lot better than most Black male philosophers in terms of engaging the Black feminist literature in their publications, because it's absent in most of the other Black male philosophers' work. And yet, even when it is engaged at the level in which it's engaged, you can still say 4 or 5 times in a chapter that race trumps gender. So this is something that I'm, working through. So in the journal that I co-founded, the Critical Philosophy of Race Journal, and I'm co-editing. Actually, we have a issue coming up where I have this critique. Shannon Sullivan's also writing a piece on Charles Mills, and then Charles is going to respond to us. So we'll see what he says. But we've done this at conferences before, kind of had this debate. And part of his, if anybody knows him, he's a very jovial person. So he joked when I first kind of talked about this with him, give an account for the Black men not engaging, the Black women philosophers. And he says, well, I'm Jamaican, I'm not African American, I can't speak for these Black American men. But I think it's something else that he's noted about that book is that, Carol Pateman wrote the sexual contract, he wrote the racial contract, and they assumed that writing the book together was going to be a big hit. But what they found out was like that they experienced what Black women experience, right? You become invisible because you have these identity categories that are assumed to be mutually exclusive. So they were actually somewhat surprised and dismayed by the lack of uptake of that text. Not only along the lines of the critiques that we may have of it, but just the general lack of interest in it. Yeah, so that's maybe a longer answer than you were asking for.
So the coffee question is
So I have coffee and dinner with Charles all the time. I don't think that I'm going to convince him to, so my effort at that is writing the piece that points out what the shortcomings are, but I'm not going to help him fix it necessarily.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Thank you very much for the panel. It was awesome. A great way to start the conference, for sure. I wanted to ask a question in light of the theme of your panel in terms of violence on Black women. And I feel like this conference in and of itself is making a major intervention on this question. But In talking about violence and talking about what you said about emotional labor and needing to know and recognize all these separate canons, the question of death, the reality of actual death and social death, I was wondering if you could speak from your experiences as academics, living and breathing within the academy, as you do work on violence and death, the actual death. Can you speak towards the violence faced as professors within the academy? Any strategies that you use to resist the trauma and violence that are existent in in a lot of these spaces? Does your work have any influence on how you respond to these everyday experiences of violence or trauma within the academic space?
Do you want to go first? I looked at her and said, do you want to go first?
I know.
Like I'm thinking, I'm processing, like which episode do I comment on? It's like picking, what would I comment? The University of Connecticut about a year ago experienced what we call the quote unquote rock incident. A group of AKAs, it was their Founders Day, and you can go out and paint this spirit rock. So the rule is once the paint dries, anybody can come back, another fraternity, sorority, or group organization can paint over your rock. Well, they came with their supplies and they were painting over a rock that a white male fraternity had just painted in honor of one of their members who was hospitalized. But the paint was dry, so the sisters could come in and paint the rock pink and green in light of Founders Day. The white male fraternity, a couple members was like, would you please not paint the rock? And their advisor, who is a graduate student, one that I work with in history, was like, well, let me remind you the rule is once the paint is dry, the next organization can paint over it. Well, they proceed to call up other white men, members of their fraternity, who proceed to harass, and it went into the wee hours of the night. Some of these students had taken my class on Black leadership and civil rights on social protests and nonviolence strategies, and they called up the Kappas to show up, who sort of like members of the nation stood, in front while the girls painted the rocks. Still, the white male fraternity showed up and they're throwing trash, throwing a football over their heads, they got their golf clubs, they're hitting trash. And so the police were called. And like I said, this is going from 11 p.m. into 3 a.m. The police show up and AKA said it's as if the white male law enforcement were like negotiating with the white males, like, can you just like leave them alone, like back up 20 feet? And it escalates and they call the sisters nigga bitches and other epithets. Now the brothers are like, we can't do it. We're standing there, but it's like their presence was almost non-existent. But it amasses to, now the cameras catch this on tape, and the university's willing to say there was 20 plus. Those who were present say this amassed to about 50 white males. There is a town hall meeting that takes place that involves Black alum, Black faculty like myself. And so to answer your question, as somebody that's tenured and could go in that space, now the young woman that was called the nigga bitch was the historian, the advisor, the graduate student. Her major advisor had been the chief diversity officer. He's a full professor in history, silent. Brother is silent. But there's a brother in Soch that's on the panel. He's loud and he's outspoken because he's got a daughter. And he calls out the white sororities for not organizing and being supportive of this Black sorority. I get up, and this is at the time of Michael Brown, and I'm the first speaker to the microphone because what the white administration does is they show up at the panel and they go into their job descriptions. It's like, don't even respond to the incident. So the crowd, like, this is getting angry, like, you're insulting. They just go into, this is what my office does. And they literally just go into statistics and what their job is. And I called them out, and I made a remark that everybody sort of kind of went wild, like we was at we were on Price is Right or something, because I said, The thing is, these white men felt so privileged that they could ignore the police. The police talk to them and disappear, and they stay on site. They come back 20 minutes later and continue to harass these young women. I said, now you know, if that was a group of black men opposite a group of a white female sorority, they would have been taken down to the ground, arrested, because I said a black man couldn't walk on this campus alone, much less be a group of 20 or more, and think they could harass a white female sorority. And I made a reference of, now, you know, if that was Michael Brown, it would have either been arrested or shot and killed, and that's when everybody went wild. But in that space, I like my good friend Kathryn in sociology, who's also from Louisiana. He's from New Orleans, I'm from Lake Charles. We're very vocal, and we kind of say what other people may be unwilling to say out loud. But the administration's response is, well, ignore. It's just literally like, we can say whatever we want to say, but I would essentially say they ignore us. So it doesn't matter how loud our voices are. The students organized, brought a petition like other students at Yale and Mizzou did to the president. It did light a fire for her to hire a chief diversity officer, which she has since done. But I have felt over the last year or more, if any time in my career, kind of helpless to make a real impact beyond my voice. And it doesn't matter, feeling like it doesn't matter what I say, because the staff side, student affairs side, can just ignore us faculty can say whatever we want to say and get people excited and riled up. And students have marched and done some protests, but we're at a crossroads of trying to figure out what next that's more effective, that would yield a greater response. It did result in a large group of African American female undergraduates forming an organization called Sisters Inspiring Sisters that meet bi-weekly in the Cultural Center. And it created a sisterhood and a community that came together, and it's at least 50 plus that show up to talk about their experiences. And I myself attend, and I'm one of their advisors to this group. So one outcome was this organization that deals with the balance, this kind of self-healing, having a retreat. They have started sort of their own programming as a result of this rock incident to heal, which really speaks to our resiliency, right? But it has evolved and taken the form of sort of their own self-help program. But myself and other black female faculty have said in a lot of ways we act as like the mental health professionals with no such training on these campuses. And so we do insist one of the demands is they need to hire people of color in mental health services, because all these units are lily white and have no people of color to be attentive to their needs. But
now I have to look at my notes. Yeah. Sorry, because I want to ask you properly. You talked about the state and social death, and this relationship between the focus on the state and privileging the state, and what the limit of that is, like the things that we miss by that. Yeah. And so it was like almost an equation I could see visually, but I didn't get all the sides of the equation. It seemed very important. I wanted to get it and make sure everyone in the audience got it.
Can I jump real quick back onto this question about, I'll do like a 10-second version. I mean, I know of 2 black women academics in their 30s who died in the last year. And I'm sure there were other medical issues, but like stress was certainly a contributing factor to that. So like this is real. So having like a massage therapist at a conference is not frivolous. You know, it's important to have those kinds of things, take advantage of those things. So I would suggest, I mean, like I said, I do yoga, I do running, I do meditation, but having your sister group, having your people who have your back, having your people who you can say, did you hear that? Did they say that? You know, debriefing and venting and talking through those things are important. having a network of people who just have your back when you're constantly dealing with these macro and micro aggressions in the spaces you're in. And then being real about what these institutional spaces can be and what they can't be. And so I think a lot of the stress and strain comes from, expecting affirmation in places where we are simply not going to get it. So I would encourage, love on your sisters, reach out to them, call them up, tell them you love them, tell them how beautiful and brilliant they are, and talk about it, get it out. Don't feel like you always have to put up that strong, being a strong black woman and put up the strong face or whatever. Express it and try to get it out of you.